Hello, everyone, and welcome to A Mighty Blaze, Poets in Conversation for January 2022. Now, officially, this is 1 year of Poets in Conversation. We just launched last year with Henri Cole and Joshua Bennett. So what a celebration to have our anniversary be with these two fantastic poets, Matthew Olzmann and Kaveh Akbar, who it seems have a real friendship outside of literature and related to literature. So it's a double pleasure to host you both. Welcome.
Thank you so
Yay.
much.
Thank you.
And special congratulations to Matthew, whose book Constellation Route has just dropped, has just come out. They're dancing. And so we're really looking forward to digging into that. Thank you both again for being up for feting it. How's it feel, Matthew, to have a new book come out?
It's a bunch of things. It feels I'm not sure what the word is. I'm mostly excited and grateful to have it out in the world, and I'm glad that people are able to have it who wanted to read it, or who wanted a place where they could find some of these poems together. And I was, the book is, many years of poems, and so I'm glad to kind of close that chapter a little bit. And it's also kind of weird that, just because it's new, and I'm not really sure how I feel. I think I was telling Kaveh before that once a book is in the world, you can no longer I can no longer change it. But like the books that I don't have in the world yet, they're like still sort of full of possibility and perfect in my imagination. Where so it's but mostly it's exciting. It's exciting, and it's exciting and strange. So.
Well, I first heard about the book when last fall you were doing a presentation through Four Way Books on Wisława Szymborska. And Kaveh, in the comments, you actually mentioned your excitement about Matthew's book coming out, which made me go and look for it. So before we get into all the formalities of bios and background and sort of the official welcome, I wanted to say welcome to you too, Kaveh. Congratulations on Pilgrim Bell. And I wanted to hear a little bit from you about what it was like to have the second book come out when Calling a Wolf was such a huge success. How has it been having the second book come out?
Yeah, thank you so much for having me here, and thank you for letting me get to be here and bask in some of Matthew's reflected glory on this most auspicious of days. Matthew very generously Venmo'd me $10 before that conversation so that I would come into the chat and gas him up about his new book, so that everyone who attended would know that he had a new book coming out. So I'm glad to hear that worked.
Mission accomplished.
Yeah. No, I've been reading this book since it was a manuscript, and it's so unlike anything else that exists. What he's doing with this epistolary. I forgot what your actual question was, but what he's doing with the epistolary form here. It's just there hasn't been another book of contemporary American poetry like it that I know about. So I'm so hyped about getting to be here and getting to sort of wave my pom-poms about it. What was your actual?
Well,
you said something.
You're generous. You're generous, and we are definitely going to celebrate Matthew's book. But I know he is with me in saying we're also going to celebrate Pilgrim Bell.
Right. So. Second book. Yes. I'm sorry. You said that.
Okay.
Yeah. No, it's been great. Yeah. I think it's really, really different from the first book. And so I didn't want to write Calling a Wolf 2. I wanted to do something, I had already written that book and written poems that sounded that way. So I wanted to do something that felt quite a bit different. I'm a different person now than I was then. And I think that Matthew was really, really involved in the process of editing this book. From like sort of proto drafts into the final draft. We had long phone calls talking about it in its kind of like embryonic stages. And so, again, it's really, really lucky to get to be here talking with him about it.
Well, welcome again to both of you. We're going to get into ways in which you have given each other feedback and advice. Also, I'm so curious and selfishly want to glean all that I can from it. But first, for anyone who's watching who's not familiar with these two poets, it's hard for me to believe, but just in case anyone's watching who hasn't read your work or wants to know more about you, I just want to introduce you more formally. First, Matthew Olzmann is the author of 3 collections of poems from Alice James, Mezzanines, which was selected for the Kunneman Prize, Contradictions in the Design, and Constellation Route, which is the new one. It reminds me, there was earlier this week an image circulating of imaging done, MRI imaging of a bird's circulatory system. I don't know if you saw this, but as soon as I saw it, it reminded me of your cover. These like sort of delicate filaments, nerve filaments of a structure. So it's a beautiful cover too.
Is that the kind of thing that? Is that the kind of thing that the job of the fan? What would you call it? The fanning.
The fanner. Our friend Julie. Yeah. You know what? I'm going to put that in the chat. If Julie can't find it, it's on my Twitter page. We can find it. All right. So Matthew's writing has appeared in Best American Poetry, Kenyon Review, New England Review, Brevity, and elsewhere. He's been awarded fellowships from the Kresge Arts Foundation, the Breadloaf Writers Conference, and MacDowell. Currently, he teaches at Dartmouth and the MFA program for writers at Warren Wilson. And Oliver de la Paz, one of my also favorite writers, says of Matthew, he has long been a poet of exceptional wisdom, and his latest collection is revelatory, which is exactly the word I was feeling as I was reading it. Each poem reaches beyond the interior landscape to address the other in timely and intimate dialogues that bend, reframe, surprise, and ultimately embrace. Deeply perceptive, this series of epistolary poems are offerings to a new age in need of understanding where we are going, where we have been, and more importantly, what do we do for each other once we've reached our destination. So welcome, Matthew. Kaveh Akbar is the author of Pilgrim Bell and Calling a Wolf, and people should not sleep on your chapbook too. I was way back, as I said to you when I first met you, I was an early adopter way back in the day. And that chapbook, that's a great chapbook.
Yeah,
so we should not forget about the chap.
Sibling Rivalry does great work too. They're a press that I feel like people Seth and Brian, who run it, have an incredible curatorial aesthetic, and they're also really, really good like on the page, just like Carrie at Alice James or Martha at Four Way, I think are like this too. And Jeff at Grey Wolf are really, really great curatorially, and also really, really smart at editing lots of different kinds of poems on the page. I think Parnesia Jones at Tri-Quarterly is too as well, but I'm getting away from myself in Northwestern.
Makes a huge difference when there's someone who's shepherding, the process, which I see on our ticker tape here. We're going to talk also about how you are shepherding the anthology of spiritual verse. But back to your book. Kaveh Akbar is the author of Pilgrim Bell and Calling a Wolf, and has received honors such as the Levis Reading Prize, multiple Pushcart Prizes. You were also in Best American Poetry, of course. Born in Tehran, Iran, Kaveh teaches at Purdue and the low residency programs at Warren Wilson and Randolph. Of Kaveh's work, The New Yorker says, Kaveh Akbar is exquisitely sensitive to how language can function as both presence and absence. His practice of taking language apart and harnessing the empty space around it makes even the most familiar words seem eerie and unexpected. And I thought was itself so perceptive, because every time I read your work, I feel like I'm meeting words again for like a new time. Kingfisher. I never will forget the first time I saw your poem, and I thought, I've never thought of a kingfisher in this way. So welcome to both of you again. First, I thought I would ask, I was reading yesterday about how Mouse had recently been banned. The book Mouse had been banned in a school district in Tennessee, maybe small town news that became a national discussion. And I was thinking about how heartbreaking it is when books are banned, in my opinion, and especially books that challenge people, not diatribes, but books that challenge people. So I wanted to hear a little bit from both of you about some of the extreme encounters with books and reading and poets that have impacted you, and sort of define the poles of how you think of your own work, like maybe what you're reaching for, what you're avoiding, what engines you turn to. Do you want to start, Matthew? I think you're muted.
You're muted. Sorry about that. So if I'm understanding the question, you started with banned books and then we're thinking about like the polls in our reading lives of like, so, well, I think I mean, obviously none of my books have been banned that I know of yet, but it's I think it was poet John Ciardi said something like the public library is the most dangerous place in town, and I remember hearing that when I was a teenager and was actually working in a library, and it was such a baffling statement. You know, when I heard it, I was like, "What is he talking about? This is like the quietest place in town." And I should say, like, I mean, I had a very literal mind as a you know, a 15-year-old or something. I think when I encountered that, but I should also say I was terrible at that job. I was a page, and like the job was to alphabetize the books and put them back on their shelves. And I would just, like, no books got put back on the shelves when it was my turn, when I was working, because I would just start picking up books and reading them. And even if I did, and it could be the most random book on the history of gardening tools, or like a romance novel, or I would just like look at them like, wonder what this is about, and start reading it. And then an hour later, someone would come in and yell like, "Why are all these books back here?" So I was not very good at that job. But I guess, like, in terms of like the reading thinking of like major events in our reading lives, like that, like working in that library, you know, might be a major one for just like, if while I was not good for that job, the job was good for me, and how it fostered a sense of curiosity. And I was constantly surprised by all the things I didn't know I was interested in, that I was suddenly interested in, and would regularly bring home like stacks of books, and then bring home more books before I would finish reading those books. And so that was kind of I think a pivotal point.
I love that.
How about you, Kaveh? Are there any books or writers who really helped you define the sort of extreme boundaries of what you think of as your playground for writing?
Yeah, I mean, there are a million of them. I love Matthew's story. We've talked about this, and my mom when I was really young, like too young to be left alone at the library, my mom would go to the library herself on her way home from work, and then pick up just like whatever their like most recently returned shelf was that like had yet to be put into the like rest of the circulation. She would just pick random books off that and bring them home for me, like truly just like rushing in, grabbing like 10 books. And so it would be just like Matthew said, you know, like a book about airplane wings, and a book about Elgin Baylor, and a book about, you know, dinosaurs, you know, and just like, and then like the Grapes of Wrath, and, you know, just like a completely random array of books. And then that would be what I had to read for the week. So I would learn about airplane wings, and I would, you know, and it was just this like completely random, uncurated way of experiencing the world. And then I got a little bit older, and when you asked this question, this is what I was thinking about. I was probably, I don't know, maybe 11 or 12 or something, and we used to get the Sunday paper, and in it there was, you know, I don't know if you remember like the Parade magazine inserts, you know, like the, you know, and in that there was like one of those like 100 books to read before you die, or else you're a sort of intellectually bankrupt piece of crap, you know. And you know the list before you even see it, right? It was like Madame Bovary, and, you know, whatever. Yeah. And I remember, you know, setting out to read the 100 books on the list, and Matthew, I think you know this story, but I got to Don Quixote, and you know, it was like any of the other books, I didn't know anything about it, and so I went to the library and I got it and I brought it home. And it was like the wildest, sexiest, queerest, most vulgar, strange book that I'd ever read in my life. I'd never, it was like so unlike anything else on the list that I had read so far. I had maybe read, 10 or 15 books up to this point from the list. And I went back to the library to get more books by this author about whom I knew nothing. And I realized that what the magazine had told me to get was this like 17th century book by Miguel de Cervantes called Don Quixote. And what I had gotten was also a book called Don Quixote, but it was by this 20th century sort of radical feminist punk Kathy Acker. And she had a book called Don Quixote about this hero named Kathy Acker, who is sometimes named Catheter throughout the book, who, and it was like it was like trans and, super queer and sexy. And like, I didn't know that, I just got the book called Don Quixote from the library. Like it was such a straight, and it was so much more eye-opening than any, I was too young to like understand, the Scarlet Letter and any, I still feel like I'm too young to understand the Scarlet Letter, but, that book, I was just like, oh shit, like you can do this in a book, like you're allowed to talk like this in a book, like a book that the library will have. And like, and so like, still, I mean, I didn't make it through the whole list, but I probably read like 30 of those books. And I still feel to this day, like Kathy Acker's Don Quixote is the one that I remember the best.
I love the idea of inverting the trunk of the tree and the branch, like that you got Kathy Acker's first before you might have ever turned, to Cervantes and like get the outlying, what we would think of as the sort of outlying, second generation of the list before the list itself. Well, I want to go back to something you said, Kaveh, and ask you a question, Matthew, about some specific poems. Early on in your new book, Constellation Route, just showing it again, you have Letter to the Horse You Rode In On, which I love. And that's from Line Break, right? Line Break, which sadly is now defunct, but they still have it up on the archives. I double checked. And I love the way in which this poem has a kind of irreverence to it. Kaveh was talking before about how, like, can you do that? Can you say that? Can you go into that? And it's not like this is incredibly outlandish or whatever, but the poem itself is playful and irreverent at times. And I wondered if you would be up for reading the poem, and also, if you would, and also if we could both of you could talk about irreverence as potentially almost a spiritual practice, or irreverence as a meditative practice is sort of what I'm thinking. So I wondered, Matthew, first, if you would mind reading that poem, and then maybe we could talk about irreverence and spirituality.
Yes.
This is page 8 for anyone who is following along. Everyone should have their books by now.
Were you saying that for me? Like, Matthew, this is page 8 in your book.
No, for everyone who's buying the book. And by the way, the people at A Mighty Blaze are putting links to the book in the chat to all the books we referenced. So go and find them.
Letter to the Horse You Rode In On. From this day forth, let it be understood. As one of God's most graceful innovations, you, dear horse, are entitled to certain provisions under the law. Granted, the law is one I just made up, but those who acknowledge its validity will adhere to the following rule. One does not, under any circumstance, say fuck you to a horse. It matters not who rode in on the aforementioned steed. It matters not what kind of jackassery said rider has committed. We shall not allow even the tangential fuck you to be cast upon this virtuous and sophisticated being, such as the fuck you by association, commonly phrased as fuck you and the horse you rode in on. No, dear horse, you are proof that one does not have the luxury of choosing the burden one carries. Fate makes an animal of us all and rides us through the village at sunrise where we are judged. But we designed those villages. We built them from our worst ideas and kept expanding until each enclave was equipped with genetically modified pigeons and flammable tap water. The human hand can reach from one ruined thing to the next. It can throw a whiskey bottle against a wall, drive a car into a ditch, wave goodbye. It can run its fingers through your mane, and if I find you, I will say you would have done a better job with this place. Unfortunately, horses don't have any say in governance, except once. It said that the Emperor Caligula nominated his horse Incitatus as a Roman consul. We should also note Caligula's reign was brief, 37 to 41 AD. Then he was slain. So your question about irreverence is one that I find really intriguing, because I think a lot of my poems are actually sort of reaching toward a space that's that's like there's reverence there, but there's also a sense of reverence or astonishment or wonder, or at least that's what it's reaching for. And I and I think to have irreverence, you have to be able to acknowledge something, something kind of grand, in order to be antagonistic toward it. So I feel like there's maybe a pull between both of them in the poems that have some element of irreverence.
What about you, Kaveh? I was thinking about the difference between calling a wolf and Pilgrim Bell. Pilgrim Bell, which feels to me as a reader even more meditative and almost more like chants than songs, if that makes sense. Like a little bit less narrative and a little bit less visceral than the first book, and more meditative and reflective. So what do you think about this idea of irreverence, or as Matthew has redefined it, a kind of reverence and awe relative to reflection and a kind of spiritual practice?
Yeah, I think Matthew articulated that beautifully. And I mean, you began this conversation by invoking Szymborska, Szymborska, and I think that Matthew and Szymborska are really kindred in a lot of important ways, and one of them is the way in which they use the sort of irreverence, or the sort of they use irreverence to gain purchase to the reader's mind, so that they are able to then, once they're in there, sort of like muck things around. The Roman poet Horace talking about Dulce et utile, like a good poem, Dulce, sweet and useful, or delight and instruct. And I think that there are a lot of poets who, I work with a lot of young poets. I know Matthew does too. And I think that people understand pretty quickly that a poem is meant to instruct, and that a poem is meant to gallop straight into wisdom, right? But I think that the delight is sometimes forgotten about, right? And delight doesn't mean like, pink baby toes or a puppy wagging its tail all the time, but it does mean like a new encounter with language, a new encounter with some sort of unprecedented experience, right? And so I think that Matthew, throughout this book and throughout his work, he's one of the great poets that I know who sort of mines this really, really smartly. Richard Pryor maybe improved upon or revised Horace, when the comedian Richard Pryor, when he said he wanted to get you laughing so he could pour the poison down. And I think that that's how Matthew, one of my favorite Matthew poems. I love the poem that he just read, but I'm also thinking of this one poem called Blake Griffin jumps over. What is it? Blake Griffin jumps over a car, and is it just called Blake Griffin jumps over a car, right?
Blake Griffin dunks over a car.
Dunks over a car, right? Yeah, and the end of it is like, I want to believe. I'm gonna fuck the line up. I should have actually looked this up. But at the end of it, you're like, I want to believe in the fabulous, because the alternative is a world where nobody jumps over tall buildings, and that seems like a pretty good Ars Poetica. That seems like no, I want to believe in the fabulous, not because I think it's authentic, but because right. It's like, not because I think it's authentic, but because I'll look up the actual quote, or maybe Julie can find it. But yeah. I think that I can't improve upon that, right?
But in thinking about how irreverence and reverence are sort of linked, and there's a line in Kaveh's book that I kind of that I kind of obsess over. There's a do you know which one I'm going to talk about already? It's one I already asked. I've asked you about before, but it's despite my efforts, even my prayers have turned into threats, which is which is in the form of a prayer, but it ends with with Lord, time will break what doesn't bend, even time, even you, which I find kind of astonishing. It's like it's this prayer that then does the thing that the title says. It turns into a threat, but it's a threat directed towards the divine. And I think you see like both a sense of heightened reverence in this poem, and also something oppositional to that. But I mean, a lot of times we sort of get at things through their opposites anyway, like love, hate, summer, winter, faith and doubt.
Well, I was going to ask Kaveh if you would read The Value of Fear, which I feel like is engaging in the same process that you're describing, Matthew, so well.
Sure. Yeah. Oh, I picked up Matthew's book to read from. Yeah, I'm happy to. This reminds me though, there's Matthew and I both teach at the Warren Wilson Law Residency Program. Matthew like half runs it, and I forget the name of your position. What are you now?
I serve on the academic board. I'm the chair of the academic board. So
he's like the
covered by board faculty.
He's like the Sultan of Warren Wilson now, but I think that's the official title, is the Sultan. But no, we both teach there, and they and they have in their on their like online store, you can listen to these like old conversations that people who have taught there in the past have given, and years ago I just downloaded like all of them that I could. I was studying for my PhD exams, and so I just like wanted to, as I was traveling around, I would just listen to them, and it was a way of like osmotically becoming smarter about poetry. But there's this one by Mary Shebist where I forget what she calls it, but she's talking about like poetic concessions, and like how like Shakespeare says, like, my lover's eyes are nothing like the sun, right? Like, in other words, like, he's like, they're not as dazzling as the sun, right? Like, he'll give you this little bit, and then like in establishing this sort of like initiatory bit of trust, like if he's like, if like rhetorically, like, I'll give you this little bit, and because now you trust me, having given you this little bit, then I can like sell you like the big sell, right? Which is like, at the end of that poem, he's like, but I find her beyond compare, and then all the other, whatever, like she's, even though, and it's kind of a hilarious poem to read, because it's like, the whole poem is like, her eyes are not particularly brilliant, her breath kind of stinks, but I still think she's great. Harriet Mullen has a really, really great version of that poem. But anyways, I think about this idea of she's so but that's kind of like the thing of the poem. It's like, she's not that great, but I still really love her, but yeah, that Mary Shebist talk about like how poets do that. They like give you like the small thing so that you'll buy the big thing when you say, is something that like, once you hear her talk about it, now I see it in like every third poem that I read, a poet doing some sort of gesture like that. It feels very much like almost like a legal debate, like a not that I know anything about that. Okay, I'm gonna read a poem. The Value of Fear, you said?
By the way, Kaveh, there is actually, and I can't remember it, someone out there will know it. Maybe Matthew, you'll know it. There is actually a rhetorical term for this from like debate.
Oh, for real?
You get people arguing, like bickering about, or, worrying about some local concern as a way of distracting them from the broader concern.
Yeah.
Mary Shebist is funny too, because Incarnadine, the first poem in Incarnadine is something about the troubadours, etc. I think it's called. Mm-hmm. And she does it in that poem, so people can go check that out.
Yeah, totally. Yeah, and it's not even like a distraction so much as it is just like, now that you've seen me say something that's like, sort of like, it's like when a lawyer's like, my client might not be perfect, you know what I mean? Like, but he didn't rob that KFC, like the my client, that initial thing that's like, oh, okay, so this guy is actually going to be a little bit honest with me, he's going to admit that, like that, yeah, if I'm sure that if you look up her conversations on the Warren Wilson page, you can see like what she calls it. It's like something like Poetic Concessions or something like that. But yeah. Okay, this is the value of fear. Is in its sound, sowing song to throat. The pale thrush trills the snow while a lonely brute hides in a fist of crickets. Hiding in the sound under the floorboards is a brute, dizzy with sound. To build a raft of the dead, you have to tie them together by their hair, and even then, it won't be crickets, it won't be a good raft. So much of escape is luck, a magnetic north sound sowing silence to each tiny muscle of the neck. The value of joy fades when you notice an uncle marching an uncle out a picture frame. So you let a child thief's hand in your pocket because you see her skin is badly scarred. The value of joy is in its asking, what now shall I repair? Dizzy, joy, dizzy is the soul with all its lies about the soul.
Yes. Thank you so much. I feel like that dovetails some of the things that we've been talking about bringing in ends of opposition, seeming opposition towards something that's, more transcendent, like, bucking binaries and all that stuff, and thinking of fear and joy as in conversation with each other. I had a related question. First, I want to remind everyone who's listening that we're going to be starting a Q&A more directly in a few minutes. So please, I know many people were messaging me privately ahead of time saying, I want to ask a question. Don't be shy. Please put your questions or comments or praise or love or whatever you want to send to Matthew and Kaveh into the comments box, and I'll be sure to pose it just in a minute here. But I wanted to move on just a little bit to a question of scope. The end of one of your poems, excuse me, Matthew, one of the speakers talks about going to find the glue. I'll go search for the glue, I think is the line. And I feel like in the poem, in the book at that point, we've been introduced or we've been asked to view the world in a kind of big broken sense as it is. And the modesty of this exercise of going to get the glue or going to search for the glue, it really does sort of speak to the way in which the small relates to the large. So I wanted to ask you both a question about scope specifically and how examination of the minute can help give perspective to the grand or help us understand the grand. And then on the contrary, how the consideration of, I call it the grand, but I don't mean pomp and circumstance. I mean the big, the celestial, the galactic, the too big to understand, how that can help make the everyday more bearable. So this question of correspondence between minute and grand, maybe Matthew, we could hear from you first since it's your poem that inspired it, if you don't mind.
Yeah. Yeah, so that poem is the title poem of the book, and it's kind of thinking about trying to find meaning in all the kind of and all the things that the speaker screws up, like whatever sort of common errors he makes, and it's thinking about how like there have been some fantastic things that were discovered by accident in human history, and so on the question of a relationship between the small and large, between I think that's I think that's the question, of I think it's basically, the old question of microcosms and macrocosms, how like the idea that the sort of archaic idea that, the human is a model for the like one human can be a model for the universe, or and the craft issue that it feels like that connects to most distinctly for me is synecdoche, where the part represents the whole. And I think many poems are sort of functioning in that way, where an individual life might be speaking to a much larger issue. So someone in West Lafayette Indiana, you know, writing about their own private concerns might be reflective of a much larger human condition. So and it goes from the private to the public, from the local to the global, really quickly in the world of the poem. If we think of it as something where the part is capable of representing the whole.
Yeah, I think about this a lot, and I was thinking about the word synecdoche too. You know, when you think about like Blake's idea of infinity in a grain of sand, eternity in an hour, or whatever, right? Like this is how writing works, right? Like you can't, if I wanted to like completely accurately with fidelity describe everything just in my line of sight right now, I could spend the rest of my lifetime doing it and still not get as precise a picture as like a simple low resolution photograph would take, right? You know, and so the language is, you know, like photography is really good at saying like this is what it is, right? Language is much better at saying this is what it's like than saying this is what it is, right? And so I think a lot about poetry as like, if you've ever seen a sort of like minimally produced theater production, right? And you know, it's like a kitchen scene, and you know, like the glass on the table tells you that you're in a kitchen, right? Or it's an outdoor scene, and like the potted ficus tells you you're in a forest. You know what I mean? Like this, you know, like you sort of like extrapolate the one detail that you see, or like the couple details that you see, and make a world of them, right? And this is how my understanding of poetry works, right? Like I could, you know, there's a tree right here outside my window, right? And and if I sat here describing it to you in the most exhaustive detail that I could, you know, if I said like in like actuarial detail, like if I said like the first branch starts, you know, 17 inches from the base of from the ground, and it comes out the right side at, you know, a 37-degree angle upwards, right? You know, that the most rigorous description that I could construct like that would be less accurate than, again, like a hastily taken photograph. You know what I'm saying? And so you either work with what the medium is good at, or you work with the insufficiency of the medium, right? And you work to sort of like use the inability of the medium to hold the magnitude of what is being expressed, and you sort of like illuminate those fissures, right? And really interesting moments of language can happen when those fissures are sort of illuminated. Does that make sense?
Yes.
I think I was thinking too about maybe a little bit of a danger of thinking of a one-to-one correspondence, you know, like when people go symbol hunting or think of metaphor as these things are, a poem is asserting that these things are the same, rather than these things are refracting and asking us to kind of reflect back on them. And the poem that really made me think about this the most, in addition to the reference to the glue in Constellation Route, was Letter to Bruce Wayne, where there are these specific details and these specific individuals and identities that are correlated to this broader identity. So maybe if you would, Matthew, we could hear that poem and then just sort of talk about it a little bit more. Also, a reminder to everyone to put questions in the chat box if they'd like, and I will turn to those next.
Letter to Bruce Wayne. A good place to hide a drop of water is a stream. A good place to hide a stream is beneath an ocean. A good place to hide a man is among thousands of men. Watch how they rush through the city like water through a ravine. I've searched many famous cities for you. There are 3 listings for Bruce Wayne in Houston, 2 in Pittsburgh, 1 in Miami, 1 in LA. In Tampa, Bruce Wayne is a retired chemistry teacher. In Flagstaff, he drives a taxi and hopes to procure a diamond for his soon-to-be fiancée. A good place to hide a star is a galaxy. A good place to hide a galaxy is a universe. Look at the night sky. Justice used to be a cowl and cape, the flicker of wings under an ateliated moon, and you, like a gargoyle, crouched atop some stone edifice. To conceal a universe, place it in a multiverse, that hypothetical clatch of alternate realities. The dilemma of the word alternate is how it implies a norm, a progenitor stream from which the alternate diverges. Which is the alternate? Which is right here, right now? There is no such thing as Gotham City, but here is Gotham City, and I've been so naive, believing the truth of the old mythologies, how they promised a recognizable villain, a clown with a ruby-slashed mouth, a lunatic's laugh. In the universe where I exist, supervillains look like everyone else. Give them an old flannel to wear and a square jawline to smile at the world. They're hanging a noose in a middle school bathroom. They're shouting, "Get out of my country," from the window of a passing car. They're pulling a pistol in a crowded bar room or bus stop or the middle of the street. They could be anyone. They could be everywhere. A good place to hide a sociopath is a full-length mirror. A good place to hide that mirror is the heart of America. In the battle of good versus evil, I was so sure good would win. Now I just hope something good will survive. Get a job cutting hair or selling cars. Make it home for dinner. I suspect there's a parallel dimension where you, vigilante, long for this as well. To have a normal life is victory enough. To remain anonymous and not be spat upon on the subway. In Boston, Bruce Wayne owns a pawn shop. In Milwaukee, he plays pinochle and feeds stray cats. In New Hampshire, he goes fly fishing on the Sugar River, reels in one brook trout after another. When he removes the hook from a mouth, he might place the fish into a cooler, or he might set it back into a stream. The alternate or the original, no longer certain, in which he stands.
It's a great poem.
Thank you.
Kaveh, what do you think when you hear that poem?
It's so good. It's so obnoxiously good. And Matthew's such a good reader too. I feel like I've seen Matthew give readings a number of times, and I feel like every time, or I have literally, I'm not being hyperbolic, I have literally seen a number of times in which people will laugh and cry in the same reading, right? Like they'll like audibly laugh, and then like they'll, and like, again, that goes to what we were talking about earlier, right? A good place to hide a mirror is in America, right? I thought that, it's just so stupidly good. I don't understand how. I mean, I just think this book is so good. I just think, like, I don't know, in the nation that I'm starting, Matthew's face will be on the $20 bill, and we'll all sort of recite these poems while we shave in the mornings. You know what I'm saying?
I'm joining the new community. I was thinking, actually, related to that there are so many similarities with this book and a lot of the work of Dean Young, for example, like First Course in Turbulence. But the recklessness, the brand of recklessness is different. I mean, recklessness, of course, is a compliment, but the brand of recklessness is different, because I feel like Constellation Route is so full of delight, as Kaveh said, but there's also real heft to it. I feel like it's somehow getting me to confront parts of the world that I know are out there and that I feel implicated in, but that are really hard to confront. And so there is this way in which it is, I feel like it would be reductive for me to say there's a spoonful of sugar, but there is this way in which, like, I'm invited to engage, I'm required to engage, but it's so pleasurable to engage the problems of the world in this way. So I love it. It's great.
I don't mean to interrupt, but like the literally, like, the rest of the spoonful of sugar idiom is like, it helps medicine go down, right? And that's the Richard Pryor thing, right? That's the Horace thing, right? Like, you get them laughing so the mouth is open so you can pour the poison down, right? The spoonful of sugar helps the medicine go, right? I mean, that's literally like, like, you're laughing, right? Or like there's something like delightful in the poem, but then like you hear the poem and you're like, Jesus Christ, like, there's like, and because the poem has made you permeable in that way, the poem has like made you open in that way, like it's able to settle in there a lot more, in a much sort of deeper way, right? Like, it's not just like, this is a poem that I'm reading and I can appreciate its technical fluency, or it's like feats of, semantic agility, right? Like, this is like some shit that like you remember months after you walk away from the book, right? And I read so much poetry, right? Like I edit poetry for The Nation, and I teach at 30 different institutions, right? I read so much poetry, right? And like I still think about these poems all the time since I first read them, right? Because of that thing, right? Like the I know it sounds corny to say, but like the spoonful of sugar helps the medicine go to, right? Like they make you permeable, right? Like mechanically from, I'm not a big fan of the word craft, but from like this like mechanical perspective, like they make you permeable, they open you up, and then they sort of like settle in there, right?
Well, and speaking of Horace, Matthew, you look just a little bit uncomfortable by how much we're like praising you. Speaking of Horace, that Ars Poetica is actually an epistle, right? His epistle to the Pisones, the sons of the Piso family. So he was writing a letter to them too, in order to say, here are my impossible instructions. Like, you have to make it grand, but it has to be small. You can't promise a mountain and give a mouse or something like that. He has all these sort of impossible to reach, really great goals. I wanted to ask you, Matthew, about specifically the epistolary form. And I've never seen a book where the poet invites other poets to decentralize said poet and write letters back. So could you talk a little bit more about how the process of letters as a kind of betweenness and a kind of relationship to other people and other ideas, how that sort of came about and was meaningful to you, and also what it was like to invite other people, Vivi, Kathy Lynch, there's so many different people who are in there. What was that process like, and why is the epistolary form something that feels true to you?
Yeah, why the epistolary form feels true to me. I think like when I first started writing as a teenager, like however many zillion years ago, it wasn't necessarily poems, but it was something sort of creative. It wasn't like a journal. I was trying to my first attempts to shape something with words. I don't know what you would call it, but all of them were sort of resembled unmailed letters. Like there's always a sort of person that it was being spoken to, whether it was like I was angry at my parents or at the universe, or like a letter of unrequited love. And all of them, like then like they're kind of angsty teenage things, which I wrote sort of angsty teenage things like well into my 30s. But but like those early attempts I think really were sort of letters. And when I was in a community college in my mid-20s, one of my teachers, David James, who's mentioned in this book, he said something like, Matthew, all poems are letters, especially yours. And I think he was kind of talking about just how the poem, there's, just in general, you want to be aware that there's someone reading this. There's a correspondence there. It's not just like the poet speaking to the void or something. It's even if it feels that way, it's like you're trying to shape an experience for another person. So even if it's not framed as a letter, you're making this thing to hopefully connect with another person on the other end. But I did have that tendency where I had like someone specific in mind in a lot of early poems, and that sort of stuck with me. And so with this, realizing I'd kind of always been writing a lot of poems that fit that mode, or that gesture to that mode, toward that mode, I just sort of one day said, what happened if I just like consciously did that and just only wrote like those poems for a while, and like was really specific about who each one was to. And then and there are other books that have, a lot of them are, they're framed as letters, but they're really kind of, apostrophe, which is kind of like a cousin to the to epistolary poems, but they're letters to things that aren't going to be speaking back. And I think there have been books like that before. Like I'm thinking, is it Present Tense by Merwin, where it's mostly speaking to like a thief in the airport and things like that. And Kenneth Coates and The New Addresses, where he's like a letter to World War II or a letter to himself in his 20s. So part of this book felt very natural to write. It felt like I was sort of embracing something that I'd been doing, but embracing it in a very conscious manner. Eventually, once I had been doing it for a long time, it started to feel unnatural because like the form started to become restrictive, and I started to look for other ways in. But inviting other people into it, or to contribute poems, I was actually kind of thinking about music. How musicians will often have like a guest artist feature on a track, or sometimes like there's someone else comes in to play guitar on a song, or they do a duet. And there's no assumption, even if it's a solo artist, there's no assumption that music has to be like just by one person. But But with books, there's, I mean, and I know there's plenty of literature that's collaborative, but I think like the dominant mode is that we think of it as the book is by one person, and just wanted to, I just wanted to think of like, well, could I do something like that where you just invite some of your favorite artists to feature on a track or something like that. So it's sort of, and I was hoping to find a way that felt organic to the project also, so it didn't seem totally random. But
I want to pose a related question to you, Kaveh. And first of all, I just want to know who you have in mind when you write poems, if anyone. And I'm going to link it, if you don't mind, to a question from one of our viewers, Mandana Chaffa. This is the editor of Nehru's. So welcome, Mandana, who I think her birthday is somewhere around these days too. So I just want to say happy birthday, Zagli. Yay to Mandana, who's awesome. So Mandana says / asks, you've talked about the epic and the minute. In terms of length of poem, do you find yourselves tending toward longer or shorter pieces in your writing practices these days? So I thought maybe we could combine these two questions, the question about what you're trending toward in terms of length, and then also who you might ever have in mind when you write poems.
Yeah, happy birthday, Mandana. Yeah, Mandana is incredible. And Nowruz Journal, Nowruz, is absolutely incredible as well. She does amazing work there. Yeah, I don't know. I want to make the dedication for my first book was something like I forget exactly the language. An eternity of gratitude to Paige Lewis, who all this is meant to impress. You know, and I think that is pretty true. You know, like Paige Lewis is the name of my spouse, of whom I am very fond still, you know, even after writing 2 books, you know, and I think that that's pretty true. They're my first reader, and I and you know, there are few. The bedrock delight of my life is having written, right? And in this sort of like Pavlovian way, you know, often when I have like finished having written, and I like run it over to Paige, and I'm like, look at this thing that I made, you know, then, and so that's probably my answer to that question. You know, I mean, like in terms of like who the poems themselves are like addressing, it's variable from poem to poem. I don't think that I have like a, you know, just as Matthew's book has, you know, a different addressee for nearly every poem, right? But yeah, I don't think that I have one consistent one. But yeah, I do think. And then in terms of the like the other part of the question was like what sort of length of the poems, or what is the length of the, oh right, do you find it tending towards, yeah. So I'm actually working on a prose thing these days, and I haven't really. This is probably the longest I've gone in my life since I was like 16, without writing poems in like a sort of, you know, I'm someone who writes a lot, and yeah, I haven't been really writing. You know how like Rodin would do like 30 like studies of his sculptures before he made The Thinker? There are like 1 million The Thinkers like all around the world, and every museum has a Rodin, you know, because he made these studies, you know. I feel like I've like done studies of poems, right? Like I have like little language webs, right? Like and like little games that but I don't have like any poems that I would like send out into the world, right? But I've been working on this prose thing, so you know, in terms of like the length, I would say very, very, very long, you know, but not necessarily poems.
Thank you so much. I know that we're almost out of time. So again, I'm going to ask if you would, Kaveh, read one more poem for us before we go. And then before we do that, I want to put a question to both of you to think about, which is if you could think of one line or one moment in your recent book that really surprised you as you were writing it. Like you wrote it and almost like you hadn't written it yourself. Does that experience happen to you? Happens to me. So I'm going to let you sit with that question while we hear Kaveh read, if you don't mind, Kaveh, Famous Americans and Why They Were Wrong.
Yes, I will read that. But can we end on a Matthew poem too? Because I don't want to. It's his functional birthday, and I want
absolutely
in the absolute most selfish reasons possible. I just want to be able to like leave on hearing one of his poems. Okay, you said Famous Americans and Why They Were Wrong. You don't happen to know what page that's on, do you? Sorry.
67, I think. I have it printed out.
How did you get there before I did?
I don't
know. Wait, 67? No, I don't think it's on my 67. Hold on. Sorry, I apologize. Unless I... Sorry.
56.
56?
Famous Americans and Why They Were
56. Yeah. Cool. Thank you. Paige just whispered from the other room that that's my favorite number. It is my favorite number, 56. Okay, Famous Americans and Why They Were Wrong. A ribbon around an oak tree reads, "Brother, the oak's roots sinking deeper into the dirt. A heart can sink too, like a root, or a library whose architect forgot to factor in the weight of its books. First you lose romance, then fiction, history. At the center of a heart is data, the same idiot degradation that turned the stars into us. I hope somebody forgets you today, too. I hope somebody cuts that ribbon free." And then the other part was a line in the book that surprised me.
Yeah, right? Something you wrote that surprised you.
Yeah. I think that, the thing that leapt to mind was in the poem, Reading Fetixod in a Pandemic, there's a line in which I say, it's like the youngest poem in the book. It's on page 53 of my copy, so right before the poem that I just read. And there's a line in which I say, because we need mail, people die. Because we need groceries, people die. And then I was like, I was thinking about the way that first person plural, the we, sort of like made it so that I personally felt less responsible, like if I say because we need mail, that's a lot less damning, that's a lot less intense of an indictment than saying like because I need mail, right? So instead of just changing it to because I need mail or leaving it because we need mail, I said I left the because we need mail, people die, because we need groceries, people die. I left in that part, and then I sort of addressed it in the poem and said, I write we need, knowing we dilutes my responsibility like watercolors dipped in a fast river, right? And so just those little moments of leaving my ethical self-protection or my obsessions with personal exoneration, leaving those in the poem, right, as opposed to sort of revising them away. There are a handful of those through the book, and those feel important to me.
Thank you so much. How about you, Matthew? And maybe after you answer, you could end us on a poem, maybe your favorite.
You're muted, Matthew.
One of these days I'll get that. I think when we're writing, you're always sort of hoping to be surprised, and those are the sort of exciting moments when you're writing, and learning to trust. Sometimes it comes in the form of what I used to think was like, oh, I got distracted and I need to wrestle the poem back into the direction that it's supposed to be going in. But now I've realized that those moments are often, that's where the excitement is. So I don't think this line is actually surprised. This line surprised me a little when I wrote it, but it's not necessarily surprising in the context of the poem. It was actually, I'm less of a traffic cop, more of an amateur thaumaturgist, and I had just learned what that word meant, like a magician or miracle worker or something. And I had written it into another poem, but it just seems kind of strange and out of place. And so I took that line, and then I was like, well, who would be saying this? And so I'll read that poem. So it became like who's speaking and why. So this is a letter to Matthew Olzmann from a traffic light in Durham, North Carolina. Actually, I'm less of a traffic cop, more of an amateur thaumaturgist. What miracles might I perform, you ask? I adjure the passage of time. Wait here, I say. Go ahead, I say. And in fits your world stops, then starts, then stops, then proceeds, then ceases, then ensues, then halts, then pulses and lurches forward, like blood through a valve to storm the command center in your cranium. Up there something seethes at every red light, authorizes your clenched teeth, your mad muttering of, God, please make this light turn green. And I say, nope. And I say, not yet. And I say, remain in place and observe. Look, there goes your world. And there it goes again. How is it that you who have begged to believe in anything see only this one road before you, this one delay, this brief intermission, not the wonderment of highways it touches, not the intersections I present, void of collisions, all wind-blown and ghost town quiet, not the order I foist upon each crossroad you encounter, these zippy motorcycles, these slick sedans, none of them broadsiding you, no fiery ruin, no wreck of Matthew, each vessel with a particular terminus, and each vessel I send on its way.
Thank you so much, Matthew.
Thank
Well, on behalf of everybody, I just want to say thank you. There have been people sending love and praise in the comments. And I know I speak for many people when I say this has been really enriching. So I want to thank you both. Remind everyone, of course, to find both books on Bookshop, on our page on Bookshop. And in fact, there are other books as well. And special thanks, of course, to Matthew and Kaveh for visiting us at Poets in Conversation. If you enjoyed today, please go and find us on Facebook, YouTube, Twitter, we're everywhere. And look for us next month when we host 2 more poets to elevate all of our day. So thank you again to Matthew and Kaveh for this rich discussion. And congratulations. I know Kaveh will appreciate me saying this. Congratulations, especially to Matthew on the new book.
Thank you so much, Allison. Thank you, Julie, too.
Yeah, thanks Julie.
Thanks for having us, Allison.
My pleasure. Thank you both so much.